Wellington had always prided himself on being predictable. Every morning at exactly 6:30, his Italian leather shoes would click against the marble floors of his Manhattan penthouse as he made his way to the private elevator. By 7, he would be seated in the back of his black, reviewing financial reports while his driver navigated through the busy New York streets. His days were scheduled down to the minute, his life a carefully orchestrated symphony of business meetings, conference calls, and strategic decisions that had built his empire worth over $3 billion. But today was different. Today, the acquisition deal that was supposed to take until midnight had wrapped up by 3 in the afternoon. The Japanese investors had been more eager than expected, and what should have been hours of negotiation had turned into a surprisingly swift agreement. Found himself with something he hadn't experienced in years: free time. As he pulled up to the towering glass building that housed his penthouse on the top 3 floors, felt an unusual sensation. It took him a moment to recognize it as anticipation. He was actually excited to get home early, to surprise his wife Sarah with an impromptu romantic evening. Perhaps they could finally have that dinner conversation they'd been putting off for months, or maybe just sit together on the terrace overlooking Central Park without the constant buzz of his phone interrupting them. The private elevator hummed quietly as it carried him up to the 68th floor. Loosened his silk tie, a small smile playing on his lips as he imagined Sarah's surprised expression when he walked through the door. She'd probably be in her art studio, the converted bedroom where she spent most of her afternoons painting. The light was perfect there this time of day, and she always said it inspired her most creative work. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime and stepped into the marble foyer of his home. The penthouse was exactly as he'd left it that morning, pristine, elegant, and silent, except for the gentle hum of the climate control system. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the imported Italian furniture, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out below like a glittering carpet. "Sarah," he called out, setting his briefcase down on the antique console table. "Honey, I'm home early." No response. The silence stretched through the vast living space, broken only by the distant sound of traffic far below. Frowned slightly. It was unusual for Sarah not to answer when he came home, even when she was deeply absorbed in her painting. She always said she could hear the elevator from anywhere in the penthouse. He walked through the main living area, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. The kitchen was immaculate, no signs that lunch had been prepared or eaten. The dining room, with its table that could seat 16 people, sat empty and formal under the glow of another crystal chandelier. Everything was in its place, exactly as their housekeeper, Mrs., had left it that morning. Made his way toward the back of the penthouse, where Sarah's art studio was located. The door was closed, which wasn't unusual when she was working on something important. She often said that closing the door helped her focus, kept her in what she called the creative zone. He could hear something now, soft sounds coming from beyond the door. Perhaps music, though it was too muffled to make out clearly. Relief flooded through him. Of course she was there, lost in her art as usual. He'd tease her gently about not hearing him come home, and then they'd laugh about it over dinner. Maybe they could order from that little Italian place she loved, the one that made the pasta she always raved about. Reached for the door handle, already forming the words of his surprise greeting in his mind. But as his hand touched the cool metal, he paused. The sounds from within were clearer now, and they didn't sound like music. They sounded like voices. 2 voices, actually. One was definitely Sarah's, he'd recognize his wife's laugh anywhere. But the other voice was deeper, masculine, and completely unfamiliar. A cold feeling began to settle in the pit of stomach. His hand remained frozen on the door handle as he listened more carefully. Sarah was talking, but her voice had a quality to it that he hadn't heard in years. She sounded happy, carefree, almost giddy. The way she used to sound when they were first dating, before the money and the business and the responsibilities had settled over their relationship like a heavy blanket. The man's voice was saying something too quiet for to understand, but whatever it was made Sarah laugh again. It was a bright, genuine sound that sent a spike of something painful through his chest. When was the last time he had made her laugh like that? When was the last time they had talked and laughed together without the conversation inevitably turning to his work, his schedule, his next big deal? Stood frozen outside his wife's studio door, his mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was her brother visiting unexpectedly. Maybe it was one of her artist friends, someone from the gallery where she occasionally showed her work. Maybe it was a perfectly innocent explanation that would make him feel foolish for the dark thoughts that were beginning to creep into his mind. But even as he tried to convince himself of these rational explanations, a deeper instinct was telling him something different. There was an intimacy in the voices beyond the door, a familiarity that spoke of more than just friendship or casual conversation. And Sarah had never mentioned expecting anyone today. She always told him when people were coming over, always checked with him first out of consideration for his privacy and security concerns. His hand finally turned the door handle. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that he would open the door to find Sarah chatting with a delivery person or maybe talking to someone on a video call. But as the door began to swing open, revealing the sunlit studio beyond, his world tilted on its axis. Sarah was there, standing near the large window that overlooked the city. But she wasn't alone, and she wasn't painting. She was in the arms of a man had never seen before, tall, dark-haired, probably in his early 30s. They were kissing, and it wasn't a casual peck on the cheek between friends. It was passionate, desperate, the kind of kiss that spoke of deep longing and complete absorption in each other. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, stood in the doorway, unable to move or speak or even breathe. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. This was his wife, his Sarah, the woman who had stood beside him for 8 years of marriage, who had moved into this penthouse with him when his business began to take off, who had shared his bed every night and his dreams for the future. But the woman in the arms of this stranger looked like a different person entirely. Her usually perfect hair was slightly mussed, her cheeks flushed with a happiness that made her look years younger. She was wearing a simple sundress that had never seen before, something casual and flowing that was completely unlike her usual designer outfits. And the way she melted into the stranger's embrace spoke of a comfort and familiarity that could only come from time spent together, secrets shared, boundaries crossed. The sound of the door opening finally registered with the couple by the window. Sarah pulled back from the kiss, her face still glowing with joy, and turned toward the sound. When her eyes met across the room, the color drained from her face so quickly that he thought she might faint. She whispered, and the word came out like a prayer or a curse, he couldn't tell which. The man with her, this stranger who had been holding his wife, kissing his wife, turned as well. He was younger than had initially thought, probably no more than 28 or 29, with the kind of casual good looks that belonged in movies or magazine advertisements. He wore jeans and a simple white t-shirt that showed off a lean, athletic build. Everything about him was the opposite of carefully cultivated image of success and sophistication. "I can explain," Sarah said, taking a step forward, her hands reaching out toward as if she could somehow bridge the impossible distance that had suddenly opened between them. "Please, it's not what it looks like." But knew that it was exactly what it looked like. The evidence was written in every line of his wife's body, in the guilt that now clouded her features, in the way the young man was looking between them with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single mistake. The comfort level between them, the way Sarah had been laughing just moments before, the fact that this man was here in their home, in her private studio, it all pointed to something that had been going on for weeks, maybe months. "How long?" heard himself ask, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. Inside, he felt like he was falling through space, but somehow his businessman's training was kicking in, the same cool control that had served him well in countless negotiations and crisis situations. Sarah's mouth opened and closed several times before she could form words. "Please, let me explain. You weren't supposed to be home until—" "How long, Sarah?" he repeated, and this time there was an edge to his voice that made her flinch. The young man stepped forward slightly, moving almost protectively closer to Sarah. "Look, Mr. Wellington," he said, and was struck by how young his voice sounded, how uncertain despite his attempt at bravado. "This isn't how we wanted you to find out." "We," repeated, focusing on the word that hit him like a physical blow. "This is a we situation." Sarah's face crumpled and tears began streaming down her cheeks. 6 months, she whispered. "It's been 6 months, but it started as just friendship, I swear. Daniel was helping me with some restoration work on a few of my older paintings, and we connected." 6 months, felt the number echo in his mind. 6 months of lies, of coming home to a wife who had been living a double life, of sharing a bed with someone who was giving her heart to another man. 6 months of being made a fool of in his own home. "Daniel," said, testing the name on his tongue. And what exactly do you do, Daniel, when you're not helping married women with their restoration work? The young man, Daniel, straightened his shoulders. I'm an art conservator. I work with several galleries in the city. Sarah contacted me because she had some pieces that needed professional attention, and we fell in love, Sarah finished quietly, the words hanging in the air between them like a death sentence for everything thought he knew about his life. Stared at his wife, really looking at her for the first time in months. When had she become a stranger to him? When had the gap between them grown so wide that she had turned to someone else for the connection that should have existed between husband and wife? He tried to remember the last time they had really talked, the last time they had made love with passion instead of routine, the last time he had made her laugh the way she had been laughing just minutes ago. "Do you love him?" asked, though he already knew the answer from the way Sarah was looking at Daniel, as if he were a lifeline in a stormy sea. Sarah nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm sorry, but yes, I love him." The words hit like a physical blow, but somehow he remained standing. His entire world was crumbling around him, but his body seemed determined to maintain the appearance of control. He looked around the studio, at the paintings that lined the walls, at the easel set up near the window, at the afternoon sunlight that had seemed so welcoming just minutes ago and now felt harsh and exposing. This room had always been Sarah's sanctuary, the one place in their vast penthouse that was entirely hers. He had paid for the renovation, for the special lighting, for the imported windows that gave her the perfect natural light she craved. But now he realized that he had been funding the space where his marriage had died, paying for the room where his wife had fallen in love with another man. "I want you out," said quietly, looking at Daniel. "Both of you, I want you out of my home." Sarah took another step toward him. "Please, we need to talk about this. We need to figure out what happens next. The lawyers, the divorce, how we're going to handle everything." Divorce? The word hit him like another blow. Of course there would be a divorce. There was no coming back from this, no way to rebuild trust after such a complete betrayal. But hearing Sarah say the word so matter-of-factly, as if she had already thought it all through, planning their separation while he had been obliviously going about his business, was almost worse than discovering the affair itself. "Get out," repeated, and this time his voice carried the authority that had built empires and destroyed competitors. "Get out now and don't come back. We'll handle the rest through lawyers." Sarah grabbed a small bag from beside her easel, had she been planning to leave today anyway, and moved toward the door. Daniel followed her, but as they reached the doorway, Sarah turned back. She said, her voice breaking, "I never meant for it to happen this way. I never wanted to hurt you." Looked at his wife one last time, memorizing her face even as his heart broke completely. "But you did," he said simply. "You did hurt me, Sarah, more than you can possibly imagine." And then they were gone, leaving alone in the studio with the afternoon light and the smell of paint and turpentine and the complete ruins of everything he thought he had built. Stood in the empty studio for what felt like hours, though his expensive Swiss watch told him only 20 minutes had passed since Sarah and Daniel had walked out of his life. The silence that had once felt peaceful now pressed against him like a physical weight. Every sound seemed amplified, the hum of the air conditioning. The distant traffic below, even his own breathing, seemed too loud in the space that had witnessed the destruction of his marriage. He finally forced himself to move, leaving the studio and closing the door behind him with deliberate care. The rest of the penthouse stretched out before him, 68 floors above the city that had made him rich, but couldn't protect him from this particular kind of poverty. Everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but felt like he was seeing it all through different eyes. The expensive furniture, the original artwork, the panoramic views, it all felt hollow now, like a beautiful shell with nothing living inside it. Walked to the wet bar in the living room and poured himself 3 fingers of 25-year-old scotch. The liquid burned his throat, but it was a clean kind of pain, honest and straightforward, unlike the complex agony that was spreading through his chest. He carried the glass to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city below. Somewhere down there, Sarah and Daniel were probably talking about what had just happened, making plans for their future together. The thought made him drain the rest of the scotch in one burning gulp. His phone buzzed against his chest, probably Richard calling about the Japanese deal that had wrapped up so efficiently this afternoon. The irony wasn't lost on that his biggest business success in months had led directly to the discovery of his personal catastrophe. If the meeting had run late as expected, he would have come home to an empty penthouse, none the wiser about his wife's afternoon activities. He might have gone on for weeks or months, living in blissful ignorance while Sarah continued her double life. The phone buzzed again, more insistently. Pulled it out and saw not Richard's name but Sarah's. She was calling him. He stared at the screen for a long moment, watching her contact photo smile up at him. A picture taken during their vacation to Tuscany 2 years ago, when she had looked at him with genuine affection instead of the polite distance that had characterized their relationship lately. He let it go to voicemail. Immediately, a text message appeared. "Please, we need to talk. I'm at the Meridian Hotel downtown. Room 1247. Please come. We can work through this." Read the message 3 times before its implications sank in. She was at a hotel. Not at Daniel's apartment, not at a friend's house, but a hotel. Which meant this was something they had planned, something they had prepared for. How long had they been renting that room? How many afternoon meetings had taken place there while was building his empire, thinking his wife was safely at home painting or shopping or doing whatever it was that wealthy wives did with their time? Another text. "I know you're angry, but 8 years of marriage deserves better than this. Please." 8 years, thought about those years as he poured another scotch. The beginning had been good, better than good. They had met at a charity auction where Sarah was displaying some of her artwork, had been immediately drawn to her combination of artistic passion and sophisticated intelligence. She hadn't been impressed by his wealth the way most women in their social circle were. Instead, she had challenged him, asking pointed questions about his business practices and whether success was worth the cost to his personal life. He should have paid attention to those early warnings. Their courtship had been whirlwind and romantic, had been building his first major acquisition at the time, and Sarah had seemed to understand the demands of his work. She had her own career, her own interests, her own identity beyond being the wife of a wealthy man. It was one of the things he had loved most about her. She didn't need him financially, didn't cling to him for status or security. She had chosen him freely, and that had made her love feel more valuable than anything money could buy. The wedding had been perfect, exactly the kind of elegant affair that befitted a man of his growing stature. Sarah had looked radiant in her designer gown and had felt like the luckiest man alive as they danced their first dance in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. They had honeymooned in the Greek islands, spending 2 weeks exploring ancient ruins and making love on private beaches and talking about their dreams for the future. When had it all started to go wrong? Tried to pinpoint the exact moment, but it was like trying to catch smoke. There had been no dramatic fight, no obvious point of fracture. Instead, their relationship had eroded slowly, almost imperceptibly, worn away by the constant pressure of his work and her growing isolation. As his business grew, his hours became longer and his attention more divided. Sarah had started spending more time on her art, more time with her friends, more time in activities that didn't include him. He had told himself it was healthy, that they were both independent people with their own interests. But now he wondered if he had been willfully blind to the signs of her unhappiness. When was the last time they had taken a vacation together? When was the last time they had made love with real passion instead of going through the motions? When was the last time he had asked about her day and actually listened to the answer? The phone buzzed again, another text from Sarah. "Daniel is gone. I sent him away. It's just me now. Please come." Stared at the message, trying to read between the lines. Did that mean she was choosing their marriage over her lover? Or was it just a tactical move designed to get him to the hotel where she could manipulate the situation more effectively? After 6 months of lies, how could he trust anything she said? He walked to his home office, a masculine space filled with dark wood and leather that overlooked the park. The walls were lined with photos of his various business achievements, groundbreaking ceremonies, acquisition signings, awards, dinners. In several of the photos, Sarah stood beside him, smiling for the cameras. She had been the perfect wife for a man in his position, beautiful and intelligent and charming at all the right social events. But looking at the photos now, could see what he had missed at the time. In the earlier pictures, Sarah's smiles were genuine, her body language open and affectionate. But as the photos progressed chronologically along the wall, her smiles became more forced, her posture more distant. By the most recent photos, taken at a charity gala just 3 months ago, she looked like an actress playing a role rather than a woman standing beside the man she loved. His laptop chimed with an email notification. His assistant had forwarded the contracts from today's deal for his review. The Japanese acquisition that had seemed so important this morning now felt trivial in comparison to the wreckage of his personal life. What good was adding another 100 million to his net worth if he had no one to share it with? What was the point of building an empire if he was destined to rule it alone? Another text from Sarah. I know what you must be thinking, but it's not what you imagine. Daniel and I never planned for this to happen. It just did. Please give me a chance to explain. Found himself actually considering it, not because he believed her explanations would change anything, but because the alternative was sitting alone in this empty penthouse, drinking expensive scotch and wondering where his life had gone wrong. At least talking to Sarah would give him answers to the questions that were burning through his mind. How long had she been unhappy? When had she stopped loving him? What was it about Daniel that had captured her heart in a way that apparently never had? But even as part of him wanted answers, another part of him was afraid of what he might learn. It was one thing to discover that his wife was having an affair. It was another thing entirely to learn that she had never really loved him at all, that their entire marriage had been built on foundations that were less solid than he had imagined. His phone rang, and this time it wasn't Sarah. The caller ID showed his brother Jake's name and number. Jake was 2 years younger than and worked as a doctor at Mount Sinai, living a deliberately modest life that stood in sharp contrast to wealth and ambition. They didn't talk often. Their lives had taken such different paths that they sometimes seemed like strangers who happened to share the same DNA. But Jake had always been perceptive about people and relationships. Hey, stranger, Jake said when answered. I was just thinking about you. How are things going with that big deal you mentioned? The deal's done, said, surprised by how normal his voice sounded. Wrapped up early, actually. That's great. Sarah must be thrilled that you're home before midnight for once. Felt a bitter laugh escape before he could stop it. Yeah, she was definitely surprised to see me. There was a pause on Jake's end. You sound weird, what's going on? Stared out at the city lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over Manhattan. He had always prided himself on being able to handle his own problems, on never needing help or support from anyone. But sitting alone in his empty penthouse with the taste of 25-year-old scotch burning his throat and his wife's desperate text messages lighting up his phone, he realized that some problems were too big to handle in isolation. Sarah's having an affair, he said quietly. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice gentle but not entirely surprised. How did you find out? Came home early and walked in on them. In her art studio, they were. Couldn't finish the sentence. Jesus, I'm sorry. Are you okay? That's a stupid question. Of course you're not okay, but where are you now? Home alone. She's at some hotel downtown, texting me to come talk to her. Are you going to go? Didn't answer immediately. Was he going to go? Part of him wanted to ignore her messages, to call his lawyer in the morning and start divorce proceedings without ever having to see Sarah again. But another part of him needed closure, needed to understand how his life had gone so completely off the rails without him noticing. I don't know, finally admitted. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Do you want me to come over? I can be there in 20 minutes. The offer surprised. He and Jake weren't particularly close and couldn't remember the last time he had asked his brother for help with anything. But the idea of not being alone right now, of having someone to talk to who wasn't trying to manipulate the situation, was suddenly appealing. Yeah, said, yeah, I think I'd like that. I'm on my way. And don't make any big decisions tonight, okay? Don't go to that hotel, don't call any lawyers, don't do anything permanent until you've had some time to process this. After Jake hung up, walked back to the wet bar and put the scotch bottle away. His brother was right, alcohol and major life decisions didn't mix well, and he needed to think clearly about what came next. His phone buzzed with another text from Sarah, but he didn't read it. Instead, he went to the kitchen and made coffee, needing the caffeine to counteract the alcohol and the shock that seemed to be settling into his bones. 20 minutes later, the elevator chimed and Jake emerged into the foyer. He was still wearing his scrubs from the hospital, his hair slightly mussed from what had probably been a long day in the emergency room. The brothers looked remarkably similar despite their different lifestyles, both tall and lean, both with dark hair and the same strong jawline they had inherited from their father. But where appearance was always carefully controlled and polished, Jake had a more relaxed, approachable presence that put people at ease. You look like hell, Jake said without preamble, pulling into a brief hug that somehow managed to convey more comfort than any words could have. "Feel worse than I look," replied, leading his brother into the living room. "Coffee." "God, yes. It's been a 14-hour day, and that was before you called with your news." As prepared coffee in the gleaming kitchen, Jake looked around the penthouse with the same expression he always wore when visiting, part admiration, part bewilderment at the sheer scale of his brother's wealth. "You know," Jake said, settling onto one of the Italian leather sofas, "every time I come here, I'm struck by how much space you have for two people." "Might just be one person now," said, carrying two steaming mugs back to the living room. Jake accepted his coffee and studied his brother's face. "Tell me what happened from the beginning." So did. He told Jake about the successful business meeting, about coming home early with plans for a romantic evening, about the sounds coming from Sarah's studio, and the moment when he opened the door to find his wife in another man's arms. He told him about the 6 months of lies, about the hotel room, about the way Sarah had looked at Daniel with a happiness that couldn't remember ever seeing directed at him. Jake listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making sympathetic sounds, but mostly just being present in the way that good doctors learn to be present with their patients during difficult conversations. When finished talking, Jake was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and looking out at the city lights. 6 months, he finally said. That's not a momentary lapse of judgment, that's a relationship. I know. The question is, what kind of relationship were you and Sarah having during those same 6 months? Felt defensive immediately. What do you mean? I mean, when was the last time you two really connected? When did you last have a conversation about something other than schedules and logistics? When did you last make time for each other that wasn't just going through the motions? The questions hit harder than expected because he couldn't answer them. He tried to remember the last time he and Sarah had really talked, but all he could recall were brief exchanges about his travel schedule, social obligations, and household matters. When had they stopped being lovers and become business partners managing the corporation of their marriage? That doesn't excuse what she did, said. No, it doesn't, Jake agreed. But it might explain it. People don't usually have affairs because they're perfectly happy at home. Wanted to argue, but he found himself thinking about Sarah's face when she was with Daniel. The pure joy he had witnessed, the way she had melted into the other man's embrace. When was the last time she had looked it like that? When was the last time he had made her laugh with genuine delight instead of polite amusement? So what are you saying, that this is my fault? Jake shook his head. I'm saying it's probably both of your faults. Marriage is a two-person job, and from what I've observed over the years, you've been pretty much married to your work while Sarah has been married to you. That's not a sustainable equation. The words stung because they rang with truth. Had always told himself that his work was for their future, that the long hours and constant travel were investments in the life they would eventually share when he had built enough wealth to step back and enjoy it. But when exactly was that going to happen? When would he have enough money, enough success, enough security to finally focus on his marriage? She's at a hotel, said, wants me to come talk to her. Are you going to go? I don't know, what would be the point? She's been lying to me for 6 months. She's in love with someone else. What could she possibly say that would change anything? Jake leaned forward, setting his coffee mug on the glass table between them. Maybe the point isn't to change anything. Maybe the point is to understand what went wrong so you don't make the same mistakes again. Again, almost laughed. Jake, I'm 42 years old and my wife just left me for a guy who's probably younger than my favorite suit. I'm not exactly looking at a bright future in the romance department. You're 42, not 92. And you're intelligent, successful, and despite what you might think right now, you're a good man who's capable of learning from his mistakes. This doesn't have to be the end of your story. It might just be the end of this chapter. Wanted to feel hopeful about his brother's words, but sitting in his empty 3 days passed before finally decided to go to the hotel. 3 days of Jake checking on him twice daily, of ignoring calls from his business associates, of staring at Sarah's increasingly desperate text messages without responding. The penthouse had begun to feel like a mausoleum, every room echoing with memories of the life he thought he had been living. The Meridian Hotel was a boutique property in Lower Manhattan, the kind of discreet, elegant establishment that wealthy people used for affairs and business deals they didn't want conducted in more public venues. had probably walked past it 100 times over the years without ever really noticing it. But now it loomed before him like a monument to his own ignorance. Room 1247 was on the 12th floor, accessible only by key card, which suggested that Sarah and Daniel had been renting this space for more than just a few casual encounters. The implications made his jaw clench as he stood outside the door, his hand raised to knock. How much of his money had been used to fund his wife's affair? How many business trips had he taken while Sarah was here with her lover, spending his wealth to facilitate her betrayal? The door opened before he could knock, as if Sarah had been watching for him through the peephole. She looked terrible, pale, and hollow-eyed, her usually perfect hair hanging limp around her face. She was wearing the same simple sundress from 3 days ago, now wrinkled and stained with what looked like tears. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him enter. The hotel room was a suite, elegantly appointed with a sitting area, a bedroom visible through an open doorway, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the Hudson River. Fresh flowers sat on the coffee table, and there were personal touches scattered around the space: Sarah's jewelry on the dresser, a book of poetry on the nightstand, a half-finished watercolor painting propped against the window. This wasn't just a place they came for sex. This was a home they had created together. "How long have you been renting this place?" asked, his voice carefully controlled. Sarah sat heavily on the cream-colored sofa, her hands twisted in her lap. 4 months, but please let me explain." 4 months, remained standing, not trusting himself to sit down in the space that Daniel had probably occupied just days ago. "So this isn't just an affair. This is a whole separate life you've been living." "It started as friendship," Sarah said desperately. "I know that sounds, but it's true. Daniel was working on restoring that painting my grandmother left me, the one that got damaged in storage. We started talking about art, about life, about how lonely I was." "Lonely?" Tasted the word, found it bitter. "You were lonely in a penthouse worth $30 million, with unlimited money to spend, with access to anything and everything you could possibly want." Sarah looked up at him with eyes red from crying. "When was the last time you and I had dinner together? Just the two of us, no business associates, no charity events, no phones or laptops or work emergencies. When was the last time you asked me about my paintings, really asked, not just, 'How's the art going?' while you were checking your email?" Opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He couldn't remember. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "We used to talk for hours," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "When we were dating, when we were first married, you used to be interested in my thoughts, my dreams, my work. You used to look at me like I was fascinating instead of just convenient. So you decided to find someone who would look at you the way you wanted to be looked at." Sarah flinched at the coldness in his tone. "It wasn't like that. Daniel didn't know who I was married to when we met. He didn't know about your money or your business or any of it. He just saw me as Sarah, an artist who needed help with a painting. And when he talked to me, he actually listened to my answers." Walked to the window, staring out at the river without really seeing it. "Tell me about him." "Tell me about him. I want to understand what he has that I don't." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "He's 29. He grew up in Philadelphia, went to art school on scholarship because his family couldn't afford the tuition. He works 60 hours a week restoring paintings for galleries and private collectors, and he loves what he does so much that he talks about it the way you used to talk about building your business, before it became just about money." Felt each word like a small cut, and he listens when I talk about my work. He asks questions about my techniques, my inspiration, my goals. He remembers things I tell him and brings them up later. When I finish a painting, he's genuinely excited to see it, not just proud of me in that abstract way that husbands are supposed to be proud of their wives' hobbies. "Hobbies?" Turned from the window to face her. "Is that what you think I think of your art? As a hobby?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Isn't it? I've been painting for 15 years. I've had 3 gallery shows, and you've attended exactly one of them. The opening night of the first one, and you left early for a conference call with London." The accusation hit home because it was true. Had always been supportive of Sarah's art in principle, had paid for her studio and her supplies and her gallery fees without question. But he had never really engaged with the work itself, never tried to understand what it meant to her or why it was important. "I provided for your art," he said weakly. "You funded it, there's a difference." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes intense. When Daniel looks at one of my paintings, he sees technique and emotion and story. When you look at them, you see expensive frames and wall decorations. Wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in his throat. How many times had he walked through Sarah's studio without really looking at what she was creating? How many times had he nodded and smiled and said, "Very nice, honey," without actually engaging with her work? So you fell in love with him because he pays attention to your paintings. I fell in love with him because he pays attention to me. Because when I talk, he listens. Because he asks about my day and cares about the answer. Because he makes me laugh and holds me when I cry and makes me feel like I'm worth more than just my appearance at charity galas. Each word was a nail in the coffin of their marriage, but found himself nodding slowly. When was the last time he had held Sarah while she cried? When was the last time he had made her laugh? When was the last time he had seen her as anything more than the beautiful, accomplished woman who complemented his successful image? Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy? Sarah's expression shifted to something like disbelief. I tried. For months I tried. I suggested we take that vacation to Italy that we kept talking about. I asked if we could have dinner together more often. I invited you to come to my studio and see what I was working on. Every suggestion was met with "after this deal," or "when things calm down at work," or "maybe next month." Felt the truth of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket. He could remember those conversations now, vaguely, filed away in his memory as minor domestic logistics that could be addressed later when he had more time. But there had never been more time. There was always another deal, another crisis, another opportunity that demanded his immediate attention. I built everything for us, he said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. The money, the houses, the lifestyle, it was all for our future. What future? We're both in our 40s now. If not now, when? When you have 10 billion instead of 3. When you're 60 and I'm 55 and we've forgotten how to talk to each other entirely. The questions hung in the air between them, unanswerable because didn't have good answers. He had always told himself that financial security came first, that everything else could wait until he had built enough wealth to feel truly safe. But the goalposts kept moving. 3 billion hadn't felt like enough, so he had aimed for 5. When he reached 5, he would probably aim for 10. There would always be another milestone, another achievement that had to be reached before he could finally relax and focus on his personal life. Do you love him? Asked quietly. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. Yes, I'm sorry, but yes. I love him in a way that I haven't felt since we were first together, before the business consumed your life and I became just another beautiful thing you owned. The comparison stung because it was so close to how he had been thinking about their relationship lately. Sarah had become part of the image he projected to the world, the successful billionaire with the beautiful, accomplished wife. When had he stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as an accessory to his success? What do you want from me? Asked. I want a divorce, Sarah said simply. I want to be with Daniel, and I want you to be free to find someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved. The way I deserve to be loved, laughed bitterly. Sarah, I've been a terrible husband. I've ignored you, taken you for granted, treated our marriage like a business arrangement. What makes you think I deserve any kind of love? Sarah stood and walked to him, stopping just arm's length away. For a moment, she looked like the woman he had fallen in love with 8 years ago, vulnerable, hopeful, full of grace, even in the midst of pain. Because underneath all the business and the money and the constant striving, you're still the man who used to bring me coffee in bed every Sunday morning. You're still the man who cried when we lost the baby 3 years ago, even though you tried to hide it from me. You're still the man who worked 18-hour days because you wanted to build something meaningful, something that would last. Felt his throat tighten at the mention of the miscarriage they had suffered. It had happened during a particularly stressful period with a major acquisition, and he had thrown himself even deeper into work afterward, using business as a way to avoid dealing with the grief. Sarah had needed his support then, had needed him to grieve with her instead of hiding behind spreadsheets and conference calls. But he had been too afraid of his own emotions, too uncomfortable with that level of vulnerability. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. About the baby, about not being there for you, about becoming someone you couldn't love anymore. Sarah reached out and touched his face gently. I did love you. I loved you so much that I lost myself trying to be the wife you needed. But somewhere along the way, we both forgot that marriage is supposed to be about building a life together, not just managing one. They stood there for a moment in silence, years of unspoken hurt and disappointment hanging between them like a ghost of what they might have been. Realized that this was goodbye, not just to their marriage, but to the version of himself that had believed success was measured only in dollars and deals. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we call our lawyers and figure out how to untangle 8 years of shared life. And I want you to know that I'm going to ask for much less than I'm entitled to. I don't want your money. I never wanted your money. I just wanted you." The words hit him harder than any anger or recrimination could have. Sarah wasn't leaving him for financial gain or to punish him for his neglect. She was leaving because she had found with someone else what she had been unable to find with him: genuine connection, emotional intimacy, the feeling of being truly seen and valued. As prepared to leave the hotel room that had served as his wife's second life, he realized that Sarah was giving him something invaluable in her honesty about their marriage. She was showing him exactly how he had failed, not to be cruel, but to be clear. If he was going to have any chance at happiness in whatever came next, he needed to understand what he had done wrong so he could do better. "Thank you," he said as he reached the door. "For what?" "For telling me the truth, for helping me see what I couldn't see before." Sarah smiled sadly. "I hope you find someone who makes you want to come home early from work. You deserve that kind of love." As walked through the hotel lobby and out onto the Manhattan street, he realized that for the first time in years, he had nowhere urgent to be and nothing pressing to accomplish. The late afternoon sun was warm on his face, and the city bustled around him with its usual energy and purpose, but for once wasn't thinking about deals or deadlines or the next mountain to climb. Instead, he was thinking about Sunday morning coffee and the way Sarah used to laugh at his terrible J6 months after the divorce was finalized. Sat in his therapist's office on the Upper East Side, a weekly appointment that had become as routine as his morning coffee and evening news. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and intelligent eyes who had been recommended by Jake after had admitted he was struggling to sleep and found himself drinking too much expensive scotch alone in his empty penthouse. "Tell me about your week," Dr. Reeves said, settling into her chair across from him with the patient attention that had initially found unnerving but now appreciated. "I fired my third assistant this month," said, not bothering with pleasantries. After 6 months of therapy, they had moved past the social niceties that had characterized his interactions with everyone else in his life. "What did this one do wrong?" Shifted in his chair, recognizing the trap in the question. Dr. Reeves had a way of asking things that forced him to examine his own behavior rather than simply blaming others. "She didn't do anything wrong, exactly. She was competent, efficient, professionally dressed, everything I should have wanted. But she reminded me of myself. Everything was about efficiency and productivity and managing my schedule down to the minute. She treated every human interaction like a business transaction, and I realized that's exactly what I've been doing for years." Dr. Reeves made a note in her leather-bound journal. "What would you have preferred from an assistant?" The question surprised because he wasn't sure he had ever thought about it. "I don't know. Someone who seemed like a human being instead of a very well-programmed computer. Someone who might occasionally ask how I'm doing and actually wait for an answer. Someone like Sarah used to be." Felt the familiar sting that accompanied any mention of his ex-wife, though it was duller now than it had been 6 months ago. "Sarah was never my assistant." "No, but she was someone who cared about your well-being beyond your professional success. Tell me, have you thought about her lately?" Had thought about Sarah constantly in the weeks immediately following their divorce, but lately the thoughts came less frequently and with less sharp pain. "She got married last month, to Daniel. I saw the announcement in the Times." "How did that make you feel?" "Happy for her," said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. "She looked radiant in the photo, really genuinely happy in a way I'm not sure I ever made her feel." "That's a remarkably mature response." "Is it, or is it just further evidence that I never really loved her the way she deserved to be loved?" Dr. Reeves set down her pen and leaned forward slightly. "We've been working together for 6 months now. In that time, you've restructured your business to allow for more delegation. You've started taking vacations. You've even been on a few dates. But you're still punishing yourself for the failure of your marriage as if you were the only one responsible for its demise." "Wasn't I? Sarah tried to tell me she was unhappy and I ignored her. She needed emotional connection, and I gave her money instead. She wanted a partner, and I gave her a provider. All of that is true, but Sarah also chose to have an affair instead of demanding that you go to marriage counseling. She chose to build a secret relationship instead of giving you an ultimatum about changing your priorities. You both made choices that led to the end of your marriage. Had heard variations of this argument from Dr. Reeves before, but he still struggled to accept it. Taking full responsibility for the failure felt easier somehow than accepting that relationships were complex tangles of choices and circumstances that couldn't be reduced to simple blame. "Jake thinks I'm ready to start dating seriously," said, changing the subject. "What do you think?" Considered the question honestly. He had been on several dates over the past few months, dinners with accomplished women in his social circle, introductions arranged by well-meaning friends, even a few connections made through an exclusive dating app that catered to wealthy professionals. The women had all been attractive, intelligent, successful in their own right. But every interaction had felt like a performance, a careful dance of mutual evaluation that reminded him uncomfortably of business negotiations. "I think I don't know how to date like a normal person," admitted. "Every woman I meet, I find myself calculating whether she's interested in me or my bank account, and every conversation feels like an interview for the position of Wellington's wife." "What would it feel like to date someone who didn't know about your wealth?" The question intrigued because he hadn't considered it as a possibility. His social circles were limited to people who moved in the same rarefied air of wealth and power that he inhabited. The idea of meeting someone completely outside that world seemed both appealing and terrifying. "I wouldn't know how to do that. Where would I even meet someone like that?" "The same places everyone else meets people. Coffee shops, volunteer organizations, hobby groups, community events. The question is, what do you enjoy doing when you're not working?" Realized with embarrassment that he didn't have a good answer. His life outside of work had been so limited for so long that he wasn't sure what his interests actually were. Golf and tennis were professional networking opportunities. The charity galas and cultural events he attended were social obligations. Even his workouts were done in the private gym in his building, isolated from any casual human interaction. "I don't really have hobbies," he admitted. "Then maybe that's where we start. What did you enjoy before your business consumed your life? What made you happy when you were younger?" Thought back to his college years, to the time before he had become obsessed with building wealth and status. "I used to love reading, especially biographies of successful people. I played piano, though I was never particularly good at it. I enjoyed hiking and camping, being outdoors. And I used to cook, nothing fancy, but I found it relaxing." "When was the last time you did any of those things?" "I can't remember. Years, maybe. I have a piano in the penthouse that I never touch. I haven't been camping since my 20s. My kitchen is mostly for show. I eat out or have food delivered." Dr. Reeves made another note. "I want you to try something this week. Pick one of those activities and spend some time with it. Not as a means to an end, not as networking or self-improvement or any kind of goal-oriented behavior. Just for the simple pleasure of doing something you used to enjoy." Felt resistant to the idea, partly because he wasn't sure he remembered how to do things without purpose or objective. "What's the point?" "The point is to remember who you are when you're not being Wellington, billionaire businessman. To rediscover the parts of yourself that existed before you built your empire." That evening, found himself standing in front of the baby grand piano that dominated one corner of his penthouse living room. It was a beautiful instrument, that he had purchased more for its visual impact than its musical potential. The bench was covered with a layer of dust that spoke to years of neglect. Sat down and lifted the cover over the keys, running his fingers across the smooth ivory surface. His fingers still remembered the basic scales, the simple pieces he had learned in childhood piano lessons that his mother had insisted upon. Slowly, hesitantly, he began to play a simple invention, the notes coming back to him like muscle memory. The music filled the vast space of the penthouse in a way that was entirely different from the expensive sound system that usually provided background noise during his rare evenings at home. This was music he was creating with his own hands, imperfect and rusty, but somehow more alive than anything that came through speakers. As he played, realized how quiet his life had become. Not just physically quiet, the penthouse had always been a sanctuary from the noise of the city below, but emotionally quiet. He had surrounded himself with the white noise of constant activity and achievement, but underneath it all was a profound silence where joy and spontaneity and simple pleasure should have lived. His phone buzzed with a text message and automatically reached for it before stopping himself. For once, whatever business crisis or opportunity was demanding his attention could wait. He was rediscovering something he had lost, and it felt too precious to interrupt. The next morning, did something he hadn't done in years. He took a walk through Central Park without any destination or purpose in mind. No meetings to rush to, no calls to take, no agenda other than the simple act of walking and observing the world around him. The park was alive with morning activity, joggers following their regular routes, dog walkers chatting with each other near the dog run, families with young children feeding ducks at the pond. Found himself noticing details he had never paid attention to before. The way the morning light filtered through the trees, the sound of children's laughter mixing with the distant hum of traffic, the easy companionship of elderly couples walking slowly together. Near the Bethesda fountain, he paused to watch a street musician playing violin for a small crowd of tourists and locals. The music was hauntingly beautiful, something classical that recognized but couldn't name. The musician was a young woman, probably in her 20s, with wild curly hair and clothes that suggested she was more interested in comfort than fashion. Her violin case lay open at her feet, scattered with a modest collection of bills and coins from. Found himself genuinely moved by the music, by the passion and skill with which the young woman played. When the piece ended and the small crowd dispersed, he approached her violin case and added $100 bill to the collection. "Thank you," the musician said, looking up at him with genuine surprise and gratitude. "That's incredibly generous." "Thank you for the music," replied. "What was that piece you just played?" "It's Violin Partita No. 2. It's one of my favorites, technically challenging but emotionally rich." Smiled, remembering his own clumsy attempts at the night before. "I tried to play some last night myself, piano, though, and nowhere near that level of skill." "You play piano? That's wonderful. There's something magical about making music, isn't there? Even when you're not very good at it." Her enthusiasm was infectious and found himself nodding. "I had forgotten that. The magic of it, I mean, I've been so focused on other things that I forgot what it felt like to do something just for the joy of doing it." The young woman, she introduced herself as Emma, packed up her violin after a few more minutes of conversation. Watched her walk away, struck by something he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't romantic attraction exactly, though Emma was certainly appealing in an unconventional way. It was more like a recognition of something authentic, something real and unguarded that he hadn't encountered in his usual social circles. As he continued his walk through the park, realized that the interaction with Emma had felt different from any conversation he'd had in months. She hadn't known who he was, hadn't calculated how his wealth might benefit her, hadn't performed or postured or tried to impress him with her credentials. She had simply been herself, sharing something she loved with a stranger who happened to appreciate it. For the first time since his divorce, began to think that maybe Dr. Reeves was right. Maybe it was possible to build a life that wasn't entirely defined by business success, to find connections with people who valued things other than money and status and power. Maybe it was possible to remember who he had been before he became Wellington, billionaire, and to discover who he might become if he allowed himself to want more from life than just financial achievement. That night, instead of working late in his office or attending a business dinner, cooked for the first time in years. Nothing elaborate, just a simple pasta dish with ingredients he had to ask his doorman to help him locate in the nearby market. The act of chopping vegetables and stirring sauce felt meditative, grounding in a way that making deals and managing investments never had. As he ate his imperfect but satisfying dinner, thought about Emma's words about the magic of making music. Maybe that was what had been missing from his life, not just the music itself, but the magic of doing things for their own sake, of finding joy in simple pleasures, of connecting with people and experiences that fed his soul instead of just his bank account. 1 year later, stood in the kitchen of his newly purchased brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, chopping vegetables for a dinner that he was cooking for someone other than himself for the first time in longer than he could remember. The brownstone was a far cry from the Manhattan penthouse he had sold 6 months earlier, smaller, warmer, more human in scale. It had a garden where he had started growing herbs and tomatoes, hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly when he walked across them, and windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street where neighbors actually knew each other's names. The kitchen was his favorite room in the house, with its restored 1920s cabinets and the farmhouse sink he had installed himself after spending several weekends learning basic plumbing from YouTube videos. Working with his hands, creating something functional and beautiful from raw materials, had become one of his unexpected joys over the past year. His dinner guest was Emma, the street musician he had met in Central Park that morning over a year ago. Their friendship had developed slowly, organically, built on shared morning walks when their schedules permitted and long conversations about music, art, books, and life. Emma still didn't know the full extent of his wealth, though she had gradually pieced together that he was successful in business. What mattered more was that she seemed to genuinely enjoy his company for reasons that had nothing to do with what he could provide for her. "Something smells incredible in here," Emma said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with her violin case slung over her shoulder. She had just come from a rehearsal with a quartet that performed at weddings and small events around the city. "Risotto with vegetables from the garden," said, stirring the rice carefully. "I'm still learning, but I think it's edible." Emma set down her violin and moved to the stove to peer into the pan. "Look at you, being all domestic. A year ago, you barely knew how to make coffee." It was true. The learning curve had been steep, but had thrown himself into acquiring practical life skills with the same determination he had once applied to business deals. Cooking, gardening, basic home repair, activities that connected him to the physical world in ways that moving money around on spreadsheets never had. "I had a good teacher," said, bumping Emma's shoulder gently with his own. Emma had been the one to suggest he try cooking as a way to relax, had even accompanied him to farmers' markets to help him learn how to select ingredients. She had a gift for finding joy in simple things, for seeing beauty and possibility where had previously seen only mundane tasks. "How was the rehearsal?" asked, adding a ladle of warm stock to the risotto. "Frustrating. The cellist is incredibly talented but has absolutely no sense of timing, and the violist thinks every piece would be improved by being played louder and faster." Emma laughed, settling onto one of the stools at the kitchen island. "But we're getting better. The wedding we're playing next weekend should be lovely. It's in a garden in Queens, very intimate and romantic." Felt a familiar pang when Emma talked about her work. Not jealousy exactly, but a kind of wistful admiration for the way she had built a life around something she loved, even though it meant financial uncertainty and constant hustle. Emma worked 3 different jobs to make ends meet: street performing, wedding gigs, and private music lessons, but she approached each with the same passion and commitment. "I have something to tell you," said, turning from the stove to face her. Emma's expression grew serious. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous, just significant." Had been planning this conversation for weeks, knowing that their friendship had reached a point where his continued secrecy about his background felt like a lie of omission. "You know how I told you I work in business, that I've been successful enough to afford this house and the lifestyle changes I've made?" "Yes, and I told you I didn't care if you were secretly a drug dealer, as long as you kept making that amazing pasta sauce." Smiled but pressed on. "Emma, I'm more than just successful. I'm wealthy, very wealthy, billionaire wealthy." Emma stared at him for a long moment, then burst out laughing. "Right, and I'm secretly Taylor Swift." "I'm serious," reached for his phone and pulled up a recent Forbes article about his latest acquisition. "This is me, Wellington of Wellington Capital." Emma's laughter died as she read the article, her eyes widening as she absorbed the details of his net worth, his business empire, his Manhattan penthouse that he had sold for a sum that was more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. "You're serious," she said finally. "Dead serious." Emma set the phone down carefully as if it might explode. "Wellington, I've heard that name before. You've been on magazine covers. You're one of those people who moves markets when they make decisions." "Used to be," corrected. "I've been scaling back, delegating more, trying to build a life that's about more than just accumulating wealth." Emma was quiet for several minutes, processing the information. Continued stirring the risotto, giving her space to think. This was the moment he had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Would she see him differently now? Would she assume he had been manipulating her somehow, or that their friendship had been built on false pretenses? "Why didn't you tell me before?" Emma asked finally. Because I wanted someone in my life who knew me as just, not as Wellington the billionaire. Because every relationship I've had as an adult has been colored by people's awareness of my money, and I wanted to know what it felt like to connect with someone who liked me for myself. And now, turned off the heat under the risotto and faced her fully. Now I'm telling you because I care about you too much to keep living a lie, even a lie of omission, and because I'm hoping that knowing the truth won't change what we have. Emma slid off the stool and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where had spent many peaceful hours over the past months. This explains some things, she said slowly. Like how you could afford to buy this house in cash, and why you never seemed worried about money even though you weren't working traditional hours. I'm sorry I wasn't honest from the beginning. Emma turned back to him and was relieved to see that her expression was thoughtful rather than angry. I understand why you did it. I think I might have done the same thing in your position, but this changes things between us. Felt his heart sink. How? Well, for one thing, I'm going to stop letting you pay for dinner every time we go out. I always assumed you were just being gallant, but now I realize you've been essentially donating to charity every time we shared a meal. Despite his nerves, found himself laughing. Emma, the cost of dinner is literally insignificant to me, less than pocket change. That's exactly why I can't keep letting you pay. This friendship has to be between equals, or it's not really a friendship at all. Felt a surge of something that might have been love for this remarkable woman who was more concerned about the principles of their relationship than about gaining access to his wealth. Okay, we'll split everything going forward. Good, and second, I want to know about your ex-wife. The real story, not just the sanitized version you gave me before. Had told Emma about his divorce, but had framed it simply as growing apart rather than explaining the full complexity of how his obsession with work had driven Sarah into another man's arms. Now, as they sat down to the risotto that had turned out better than he had hoped, told Emma the complete truth about his marriage, his failures as a husband, and the painful lessons he had learned about the cost of prioritizing success over relationships. Emma listened without judgment, asking occasional clarifying questions, but mostly just being present in the way that had characterized their entire friendship. When finished the story, Emma was quiet for a while before speaking. Thank you for telling me all of that. It explains a lot about who you are now, about why you've been so intentional about changing your life. Do you think I'm too damaged for someone to love? Asked, surprised by his own vulnerability. Emma reached across the table and took his hand. I think you're someone who made mistakes and learned from them. I think you're someone who had the courage to completely rebuild his life when he realized it wasn't working. And I think you're someone who's become a much better person through the process of losing everything that you thought mattered. Felt tears prick his eyes. Emma, I need to tell you something else. More secrets. Not a secret, a truth. I think I'm falling in love with you. Emma squeezed his hand but didn't respond immediately. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but serious. I care about you deeply. You've become one of the most important people in my life. But I need to know that you're falling in love with me, not with the idea of me as the woman who doesn't care about your money. The question stopped cold. Was he in love with Emma herself, or with what she represented, a connection unburdened by expectations and calculations? He thought about the things that drew him to her. Her infectious laugh, her passion for music, her ability to find wonder in small moments, her fierce independence, her complete lack of pretense. He thought about how she challenged him to think differently, how she had encouraged him to rediscover parts of himself he had forgotten existed. I'm falling in love with you because you make me want to be a better person, said slowly. Because you've shown me what it feels like to value experiences over achievements. Because you're brave enough to live your passion even when it's difficult, and because you've taught me that there's magic in ordinary moments if you're paying attention. Emma smiled and saw tears gathering in her eyes. I love you too, not despite your wealth and not because of it, but for who you are when you're not thinking about it at all. They moved to the living room after dinner, Emma with her violin, and at the upright piano he had purchased to replace the baby grand he had sold with the penthouse. They played together, simple pieces that could manage and more complex melodies that showcased Emma's skill. The music filled the brownstone with warmth and life, creating something beautiful together that neither could have achieved alone. Later that night, as they sat on the couch with Emma's head resting on shoulder, she asked the question that he had been expecting. What happens now? With us, I mean, we come from completely different worlds. had been thinking about this question for months, ever since he had begun to acknowledge his feelings for Emma. I don't think we come from different worlds anymore. We both live here, in this world where people work and love and struggle and create meaning from ordinary moments. My bank account is just a number. It doesn't determine what kind of person I am or what kind of relationship we can build. But it does affect practical things. Where we live, how we spend our time, what kind of future we can plan together. Turned to face her more fully. Emma, I've spent most of my adult life trying to find meaning in accumulating wealth. But this past year, the happiest I've been is when I'm doing simple things, cooking, gardening, playing music, talking with you. If you'll let me, I want to build a life where those simple things are the foundation, and everything else is just details. Emma was quiet for a long moment, and could almost see her working through the implications. I don't want to be a kept woman, she said finally. I don't want to quit my jobs and become someone who depends on you financially. I wouldn't ask you to. I love watching you work, love seeing how passionate you are about music. I would never want to take that away from you. And I don't want you to become someone who pretends to be less successful than you are. Your business accomplishments are part of who you are, and I respect that. Felt a wave of relief that Emma was thinking practically about how they could build something together rather than running from the complications. So, what are you saying? Emma smiled and kissed him softly. I'm saying that I want to try. I want to see if we can build something real together, something that honors both of our lives and values. Even though it will be complicated. Especially because it will be complicated. The best things in life usually are. As held Emma close, listening to the sounds of their Brooklyn neighborhood settling. For the first time in months, felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Not hope for a specific outcome or achievement, but hope for the possibility of a life that was richer and more meaningful than anything he had built so far, Oaks, and the possibility that somewhere out there was a woman who could love him not for what he owned, but for who he was when he allowed himself to be vulnerable and present, and real with the ruins of his marriage scattered around him. The future felt like a vast, unknowable territory filled with nothing but uncertainty and loss.